A royal dinner that should have brought families together instead ended in shocking silence. When 6-year-old Prince Louis refused to take his seat next to Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, the entire room froze. What happened next would reveal a heartbreaking truth that had been building for months. The young prince's defiance wasn't just childish behavior. It was a desperate cry for help that exposed deep wounds within the royal family. This is the untold story of what really happened that night, and why a little boy felt he had to make one last stand to protect what mattered most to him. The grand dining room at Windsor Castle was prepared with perfect precision. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier light, and white roses decorated the long mahogany table. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner, nothing formal or complicated. King Charles had invited both sides of his blended family to join together for an evening meal. He hoped it would help everyone get along better and feel more connected as one united family. Prince Louis walked into the dining room holding his mother Catherine's hand. The 6-year-old boy looked smart in his navy sweater and pressed trousers. His older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, had already taken their seats near their father, Prince William. Everything seemed normal at first. The family exchanged polite greetings and small smiles. Then Louis noticed the place card with his name on it. He was seated between Tom Parker Bowles, Queen Camilla's son from her first marriage, and Laura Lopes, Camilla's daughter. The young prince stopped walking. A small hand tightened around his mother's fingers. Catherine looked down at her youngest child and saw something unexpected in his blue eyes. It was not just stubbornness or a passing mood. There was real distress there. Mixed with determination, Louis shook his head slowly. He refused to move toward his assigned seat. The room grew quiet as everyone noticed the little prince standing frozen near the doorway. King Charles looked up from his conversation with Camilla and saw his grandson refusing to sit down. William and Catherine exchanged worried glances. They had seen Louis upset before, but this was different. Their normally cheerful son looked like he was ready to stand his ground no matter what happened. Queen Camilla smiled warmly at Louis and gestured toward the empty chair. She tried to make the moment feel light and easy, but Louis did not smile back. Instead, he took a step backward, closer to his mother. His bottom lip trembled slightly, but he did not cry. He just kept shaking his head in quiet refusal. Tom Parker Bowles, who was already seated at the table, noticed the tension building. He was a grown man in his late 40s with his own children. He had always tried to be friendly with William's kids during these family gatherings. Tom felt uncomfortable being at the center of this awkward moment. He shifted in his chair and looked down at his empty plate, unsure what to say or do. Prince William stood up from his seat. He walked over to Louis and knelt down beside him so they were at eye level. In a gentle voice, he asked his son what was wrong. Louis looked at his father with those serious eyes that seemed too old for such a young face. The boy whispered something that only William could hear. Whatever Louis said made William's expression change completely. The easy smile disappeared from his face. He looked troubled and sad all at once. Catherine moved closer to hear what was being discussed. When Louis repeated his words to his mother, her face showed the same mixture of pain and understanding that William's had shown. She placed her hand on Louis's shoulder and squeezed it gently. It was clear that the adults were starting to understand. Something important. Something that had been building up inside their youngest child for quite some time. King Charles cleared his throat from his position at the head of the table. His voice carried authority, even when he was trying to sound kind. He suggested that perhaps Louis was just tired or hungry, and that once everyone sat down and started eating, everything would feel better. It was the practical response of someone trying to keep peace and move past an uncomfortable situation. But Louis was not backing down. The 6-year-old boy found his voice, small but steady. He said he wanted to sit with his family, pointed to the other side of the table where George and Charlotte were seated. There were no empty chairs there. Rearranging everything would mean acknowledging that the original seating plan had been wrong somehow. The request seemed simple enough on the surface. Any child might want to sit near their siblings at dinner. But everyone in that room understood there was something deeper happening. This was not about chairs or table arrangements. This was about belonging, about feeling safe and included, about protecting something precious that felt threatened. Camilla's face flushed slightly. She had worked hard to plan this dinner and make everyone feel welcome. Laura Lopes looked uncomfortable, sensing that somehow this situation involved her family, even though no one had said anything directly critical. The tension in the room grew thicker with each passing second of silence. Prince George, who was 11 years old, and more aware of family dynamics than most children his age, watched his little brother with protective concern. Charlotte, at 9 years old, understood something was very wrong. She reached across the table as if she could somehow pull Louis to safety through sheer will. William made a decision. He stood up fully and spoke to his father in a tone that was respectful but firm. He said that perhaps the seating arrangements needed to be reconsidered. Charles bristled at this suggestion. He had been trying so hard to blend their families together, to make everyone accept that his marriage to Camilla meant bringing two family groups into one. Having his own grandson refuse to participate felt like a public rejection of everything he was trying to build. The staff members standing quietly along the walls could feel the uncomfortable energy in the room. They knew better than to move or speak. These moments of family tension were always the hardest to witness. They had served the royal family for years and had seen many difficult situations. But watching a small child take such a strong stand against the king's wishes was unusual and deeply uncomfortable. Louis remained standing in the exact same spot. He had not moved forward toward his assigned seat, and he had not run away from the room in tears as some might have expected. He simply stood there, holding on to the truth of his feelings with remarkable strength for someone so young. His refusal was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet and absolute. Catherine whispered something to William. He nodded and turned back to Louis. The communication between the three of them was wordless, but clear. They were a unit, and they would face this situation together. William picked up Louis and held him against his chest. The boy wrapped his arms around his father's neck and finally, silently, allowed a few tears to fall. The dinner that was supposed to bring everyone together had instead revealed a crack that had been growing for months. It was a crack that adults had perhaps chosen not to see because acknowledging it would mean admitting that blending their families was harder and more painful than anyone wanted to accept. But Louis, in his honest and innocent way, had forced everyone to see what had been hidden. Something had been hurting this child deeply enough that he was willing to break royal protocol and risk disappointing his grandfather. The king, just to make it stop, the tension from the dinner table followed. William and Catherine, as they carried Louis away from the dining room. They walked through the long corridors of Windsor Castle until they reached a smaller, private sitting room. William set Louis down gently on a cushioned sofa. Catherine sat beside him, while William took a chair across from them. For a long moment nobody spoke. They just sat together in the quiet safety of that room, away from the expectations and pressures waiting back in the dining hall. Catherine brushed Louis's hair back from his forehead. With her hand, she asked him in the softest voice to tell them everything. She promised that whatever he said would be taken seriously, that he would not get in trouble for being honest. Louis looked between his parents, trying to find the right words to explain feelings that even adults struggle to express clearly. The story that came out was not about one single incident. It was about many small moments that had piled up over the past several months. Louis began to describe times when Tom Parker Bowles had visited the family at various royal residences. At first, the boy explained, everything seemed fine. Tom would say hello and ask basic questions about school or hobbies. But then something started to change. Louis told his parents that Tom had begun making comments that felt strange and hurtful. During one visit to Highgrove, Tom had laughed and said that Louis was lucky to get to live in such nice houses since his own grandfather had not been king when he was young. The comment was phrased like a joke, but it carried an edge that made Louis feel like Tom thought he did not really deserve what he had. At another family gathering during the summer, Louis said Tom had asked him loudly in front of other relatives whether he knew how to do anything useful or if he just planned to have people wait on him his whole life. Tom had laughed after saying it, and some other adults had chuckled too, treating it as harmless teasing. But Louis had felt embarrassed and small, did not understand why Tom would say something that made him feel bad about himself. Catherine's face grew more troubled as she listened. William leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly. These were not the kind of obvious cruel actions that would be easy to point out and condemn. They were subtle digs wrapped in humor, the kind of behavior that adults sometimes dismiss as just teasing or not meaning any harm. Louis continued with more examples. He talked about a time when Tom had come to a birthday celebration for Princess Charlotte. Louis had been excited to show Tom and some other guests a painting he had made at school. He was proud of it because his teacher had put a gold star on the corner. Tom had looked at the painting and said something like, "Well, at least they are not expecting you to be an artist when you grow up," before walking away to talk to someone else. The 6-year-old struggled to explain why these moments hurt so much. He said it felt like Tom was always trying to remind him that he was just a little kid who did not matter very much. He said Tom never talked that way to George, who was older and would someday be king. Tom was polite and interested when he spoke to George. But with Louis, there was always that tone in his voice, like he found the youngest prince amusing in a way that was not quite kind. William asked his son why he had not told them about this before. Louis looked down at his hands and said he thought maybe he was just being too sensitive, that maybe he was not understanding the jokes correctly. He had heard adults say many times that he needed to have a thicker skin and not take things so personally. So he had tried to ignore the uncomfortable feelings Tom's words created inside him. But then, something bigger had happened just a few days before this dinner. Louis explained that Tom had visited them at Kensington Palace, while William and Catherine were briefly away handling some official business. The children had been in the care of their nanny, but Tom had stopped by to drop something off for King Charles. He ended up staying for a little while, and the nanny had offered him tea in the kitchen. Louis had walked into the kitchen to get a snack and found Tom talking to the nanny. When Louis entered, Tom had made a comment about how the younger royals were always underfoot, always demanding attention and treats. He said it with a smile, but then added that at least when these kids grew up, they would learn they were not really as special as everyone told them they were. The nanny had looked uncomfortable but said nothing to disagree. Louis had grabbed his snack quickly and left the room. But those words had stuck with him. They were not really as special as everyone told them they were. The statement felt like it was trying to erase something important about who Louis was and where he belonged in his own family. That night, Louis had trouble sleeping. He kept thinking about all the little comments and strange looks. All the times Tom had made him feel smaller and less important. He thought about how Tom was Queen Camilla's son, which meant he was connected to Grandfather Charles in a way that felt confusing. If Tom did not really like Louis, did that mean Grandfather Charles did not think Louis was special either? Did it mean his place in the family was not as secure as he thought? Catherine pulled Louis close and held him tightly. She told him that nothing Tom said could change who he was or how much he was loved. She explained that sometimes adults say thoughtless things, and sometimes people feel jealous or uncomfortable around royal children because the situation is unusual. But none of that meant Louis had done anything wrong, or that he deserved to be treated with anything less than respect. William's expression had grown darker as he listened to everything his youngest son had experienced. He felt angry at himself for not noticing sooner that something was bothering Louis. He felt protective fury toward anyone who would make his child feel unwelcome or unworthy. But he also felt a complicated sadness, because addressing this problem meant confronting his father and stepmother about the behavior of Camilla's son. The relationship between William and Camilla had always been complex. William had been a teenager when his mother Diana died, and he had watched his father marry the woman who had been part of the reason his parents' marriage fell apart. Over the years, William had made peace with the situation for the sake of family unity. He was polite to Camilla and accepted her role as queen, but that acceptance had required him to swallow a lot of old pain and resentment. Now his son was experiencing a different kind of pain connected to that same blended family situation. Louis was being made to feel like an outsider by someone who was essentially a step-relative, someone who had no official royal role, but who got access to the family because of Camilla's position. William realized that he had been so focused on maintaining peace and not causing drama that he had failed to protect his child from subtle emotional harm. Catherine asked Louis if there was anything else he wanted to tell them. The boy nodded slowly. He said that the reason he refused to sit next to Tom at dinner was because he felt like accepting that seat, would be accepting all the ways Tom had made him feel small and unimportant. He said it felt like sitting there would mean agreeing that Tom's view of him was correct. that he was just a silly little boy who did not really matter. Louis looked up at his parents with eyes that were red from crying but also clearer now that he had shared his burden. He said he was sorry for causing trouble and making grandfather Charles upset. But he also said, in his small, honest voice, that he could not pretend everything was okay when it was not. He said he needed his parents to know what was happening so they could help him, because he did not know how to make the bad feelings go away by himself. William and Catherine exchanged a long look. In that silent communication between spouses who know each other deeply, they agreed on what needed to happen next. They would need to have a very difficult conversation with King Charles and Queen Camilla. They would need to set boundaries about how Tom Parker Bowles was allowed to interact with their children. They would need to risk causing offense and creating family drama in order to protect their son's emotional well-being. Before they could do any of that, they needed to make sure Louis understood that he had done the right thing by refusing to sit in that chair. Catherine told him that speaking up when something feels wrong is not causing trouble. It is being brave and honest. She said that his feelings mattered just as much as anyone else's feelings, and that no one had the right to make him feel bad about himself through mean jokes or dismissive comments. William added that being part of the royal family came with many challenges and pressures, but it should never mean accepting disrespect from anyone. He told Louis that he was proud of him for standing up for himself, even though it was scary and uncomfortable. He promised that from now on, they would pay closer attention and make sure Louis never had to face this kind of situation alone again. While William and Catherine were comforting Louis in the private sitting room, the atmosphere back in the dining room had grown increasingly strained. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his face showing frustration mixed with concern. He had wanted this evening to be a success, a demonstration that his blended family could function harmoniously. Instead, his youngest grandson had essentially rejected the entire arrangement in front of everyone. Queen Camilla tried to maintain her composure, but those closest to her could see that she was upset. Her son Tom sat quietly now, no longer making any attempts at conversation. Laura Lopes whispered something to her husband, and they both looked uncomfortable. Prince George and Princess Charlotte remained in their seats, but they were not eating. They were worried about their little brother, and uncertain about what would happen next. A staff member approached King Charles quietly and informed him that the Prince and Princess of Wales had taken Louis to a private room and would not be returning to dinner. Charles dismissed the staff with a wave of his hand and stood up from the table. He announced that perhaps it was best to postpone the meal, that clearly some family matters needed to be addressed before they could continue. Camilla stood as well, and for a moment she and Charles spoke in low voices that others could not quite hear. Tom got up from his chair and approached his mother. He asked if he had done something wrong, if the young prince's behavior had something to do with him. Camilla shook her head quickly, too quickly, and told him not to worry about it. But Tom was not convinced. He was uncomfortable with the way the situation had unfolded and the way everyone seemed to be avoiding eye contact with him. Meanwhile, William had left Catherine and Louis in the sitting room and was making his way back toward the dining area. He needed to speak with his father, and he knew the conversation would be difficult. As he walked through the ornate hallways, he rehearsed in his mind what he needed to say. He had to be respectful of his father's position as king, but he also had to be absolutely clear about protecting his children. William entered the dining room just as people were beginning to leave the table. Charles saw his son and gestured for him to follow him to a private study. The two men walked in silence until they reached the wood-paneled room lined with books and family photographs. Charles closed the door behind them and turned to face William with an expression that mixed parental concern with royal irritation. Charles spoke first. He said that Louis's behavior at dinner had been inappropriate and embarrassing. He suggested that perhaps the boy was being spoiled or not taught proper manners and respect for family gatherings. He reminded William that as future kings, the children needed to learn how to handle uncomfortable social situations with grace and diplomacy. William listened without interrupting. When his father finished speaking, William took a breath and began to explain what Louis had told him and Catherine. He described the pattern of comments from Tom Parker Bowles, the subtle put-downs disguised as jokes, the ways Louis had been made to feel unwelcome and unimportant. He spoke calmly, but with absolute conviction about what his son had experienced. Charles's reaction was defensive at first. He said that Tom was a good man who had always been friendly with the younger royals. He suggested that Louis might be misunderstanding adult humor or being overly sensitive. He pointed out that blending families is always complicated and that everyone needs to make adjustments and compromises. He seemed to be implying that Louis should simply learn to deal with whatever mild teasing he might receive. This response made William's controlled demeanor crack slightly. His voice remained respectful, but grew firmer. He told his father that a 6-year-old child should not have to develop thick skin, against comments from his own extended family members. He said that dismissing Louis's feelings as oversensitivity was exactly the kind of response that teaches children not to speak up when something is wrong, William continued, by pointing out that this was not about childish sensitivity. It was about an adult man who had repeatedly made a small child feel diminished and unwelcome. Whether Tom Parker Bowles intended harm or thought he was being funny did not change the impact his words had on Louis. William said that as Louis's father, he would not allow this pattern to continue. Charles looked genuinely troubled now. He asked if William was certain about all of this, if perhaps Louis was not exaggerating or confusing different incidents. William met his father's eyes directly and said that his son had no reason to make up such detailed accounts of feeling hurt. He asked Charles to consider why Louis would risk the king's displeasure by refusing to sit at that dinner table unless something was truly wrong. The study fell silent for a moment. Charles moved to the window and looked out at the darkening grounds. He was caught between his loyalty to Camilla and her family and his responsibility to his grandchildren. He had worked so hard to have Camilla accepted and integrated into the royal family. Any suggestion that her children were causing problems threatened that carefully constructed harmony. But William was not backing down. He told his father that boundaries needed to be established immediately. Tom Parker Bowles should not have unsupervised time with William's children. Any family gatherings where Tom was present would need to be structured in ways that limited his interaction with the younger children. And there needed to be a clear conversation with Tom himself about appropriate ways to speak to and about the children. Charles turned from the window, his face showing the weight of the situation. He asked what William expected him to do to ban Camilla's son from family events entirely. William responded that he was not asking for anyone to be banned, but he was insisting that his children's emotional safety come first. If Tom could not interact with the children in a respectful and kind manner, then his access to them would be limited. The king asked if William had considered how this would affect Camilla, how hurt she would be to have her son essentially accused of bullying behavior. William's response was direct. He said he understood it would be painful, but Camilla's feelings could not be prioritized over Louis's well-being. He reminded his father that Camilla was an adult who could process difficult emotions with support, while Louis was a child who deserved to feel safe and valued in his own family. Charles sat down heavily in his chair. He looked older suddenly, worn down by the complications of trying to hold together a family with so many fractures and sensitivities. He asked William what he wanted to happen next, how they should proceed from this point. William outlined his expectations clearly. First, there needed to be an honest conversation with Tom about the impact of his words and behavior. That conversation should involve making it clear that any future comments that made the children feel diminished would result in limited access. Second, seating arrangements and family gathering plans should be made with input from William and Catherine, guarding their children's comfort. Third, if Tom could not understand or accept these boundaries, then he would not be included in events where the younger children were present. The king listened to these demands, the mixture of resignation and resistance. He pointed out that William was essentially asking him to choose between his wife's family and his son's family. William responded that he was not asking his father to choose. He was asking him to enforce basic standards of respectful behavior toward children. That should not be a controversial request in any family, royal or otherwise. Their conversation went in circles for a while, with Charles trying to find compromises that would soften the situation, and William holding firm on his core requirements. Eventually, Charles agreed that he would speak with Camilla and that together they would address the situation with Tom. He could not promise what Tom's reaction would be, but he acknowledged that something needed to change. William thanked his father, but also made it clear that if the situation was not adequately addressed, he and Catherine would simply limit their children's participation in extended family events. He said they would continue to fulfill their royal duties and maintain proper relationships with the king and queen, but their first responsibility was to their children's well-being. As William left the study to return to Catherine and Louis, he felt emotionally exhausted. Standing up to his father was never easy. Doing so in defense of his son's feelings rather than some clear-cut rule violation made it even more complicated. But he also felt certain that he had done the right thing. Louis had been brave enough to speak his truth, and William needed to be brave enough to defend it. Back in their private sitting room, Catherine had gotten Louis to eat a little bit of food that staff had brought them. The boy was calmer now, though still subdued. When William returned and told them about the conversation with King Charles, Louis looked up at his father with an expression of relief and gratitude. He had been heard. His feelings had been taken seriously. His parents had fought for him. The days following the disrupted dinner were tense and uncomfortable for everyone involved. King Charles kept his word and arranged a private conversation with Queen Camilla about the situation. That conversation, which took place in their private quarters, was difficult and emotional. Camilla was initially defensive about her son, insisting that Tom would never intentionally hurt a child, and that the entire situation was probably just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Charles explained everything William had told him about the pattern of comments and the impact they had on Louis. He tried to be gentle but honest about the fact that, regardless of Tom's intentions, the outcome was a 6-year-old boy who felt so unwelcome that he refused to sit at a family dinner. Camilla listened with growing distress. She loved her children and had always wanted them to be accepted as part of the royal family. Even though they had no official titles or roles, the conversation between Camilla and Tom happened 2 days later. She asked him to meet her at Clarence's house, away from other family members. When Tom arrived, he could tell from his mother's expression that something serious needed to be discussed. Camilla struggled to find the right words at first. She did not want to attack or blame her son, but she needed to convey the gravity of what had happened. Tom listened as his mother explained how his interactions with Prince Louis had been perceived. His initial reaction was surprise and denial. He said he had always tried to be friendly with William's children. He insisted that any jokes he made were meant to be light-hearted and fun, not hurtful. He genuinely seemed confused that anyone had taken his comments as mean-spirited. Camilla asked him to think back on specific things he had said, using examples that William had provided. As she repeated the comments about Louis not being special, about him being underfoot, about not deserving what he had, Tom's expression began to change. He started to hear his own words from a different perspective. What had seemed like harmless teasing to him suddenly sounded less innocent when repeated back in the context of a child. Feeling targeted and diminished, Tom grew quiet and thoughtful. He admitted that he sometimes felt awkward around the younger royals. He explained that his own children had grown up without titles or special privileges, living relatively normal lives despite their connection to the royal family. Seeing William's children receive so much attention and live such protected, privileged lives sometimes triggered feelings of resentment that he had not fully acknowledged to himself. He said that maybe he had been taking out those complicated feelings through small comments that allowed him to feel slightly superior or more grounded in reality. He had not thought about how those comments would land on a 6-year-old child who was just trying to navigate his own unusual life. Tom looked genuinely remorseful as he realized that his unexamined jealousy and discomfort had hurt an innocent kid. Camilla told her son that going forward, there would need to be clear boundaries. If he could not interact with William's children in a consistently kind and supportive way, then his presence at family gatherings with the children would be limited. She said she loved him completely, but she also needed to respect the fact that William and Catherine had every right to protect their children from any behavior that made them feel bad about themselves. Tom accepted these terms. He asked if there was a way he could apologize to Louis directly to try to make things right. Camilla said she would need to discuss that with William and Catherine first, that it was their decision whether an apology would be helpful or just create more discomfort for Louis. When Camilla relayed this conversation to King Charles, he felt some relief that Tom had shown understanding and remorse. Charles then reached out to William to update him on what had happened. William listened carefully to his father's account of both conversations. He appreciated that action had been taken, but he also remained cautious about whether real change would occur. William discussed everything with Catherine, and together they decided that they would accept an apology from Tom to Louis, but only if it was handled in a specific way. They did not want a formal, awkward scene that would make Louis feel more uncomfortable. Instead, they arranged for Tom to visit them at Kensington Palace one afternoon when just William, Catherine, and Louis would be present. Tom arrived looking nervous and genuinely apologetic. William and Catherine greeted him politely but without warmth. They brought Louis into the room, and the little boy stayed close to his mother's side, watching Tom with wary eyes. Tom knelt down so he was at Louis's level, just as William had done during the dinner incident. Tom told Louis that he was very sorry for saying things that had hurt his feelings. He explained that he had been thoughtless and had not realized how his words sounded to someone Louis's age. He said that Louis was a great kid and deserved to feel happy and safe around all of his family members. Tom promised that, from now on, he would be more careful and more kind in how he spoke to and about Louis. Louis listened quietly to the apology. When Tom finished speaking, the boy looked up at his parents as if seeking permission to respond. Catherine nodded encouragingly. Louis told Tom in his small but steady voice that the words had hurt him a lot because they made him feel like he did not belong or matter. He said he was glad Tom was sorry, but he also wanted Tom to know that being nice should not be hard or something you have to remember to do. It should just be normal. The simple wisdom of this statement hit Tom hard. He nodded and told Louis he was absolutely right. William and Catherine were both struck by their son's ability to articulate something so true and important. Tom stood up and thanked William and Catherine for giving him the chance to apologize. He said he understood if they needed time and space, and that he would respect whatever boundaries they set going forward. After Tom left, William and Catherine asked Louis how he felt about the apology. Louis said it was good that Tom said sorry, but he was not sure yet if Tom really meant it or if things would actually be different next time. His parents told him that was a very smart way to think about it. They said people's actions over time would show whether their words were genuine. They promised Louis that they would be watching carefully to make sure he was always treated with respect and kindness. In the weeks that followed, the family relationship slowly began to adjust to the new reality. Tom Parker Bowles attended a few family events but kept his distance from the younger children, interacting only briefly and with carefully positive comments. Laura Lopes, who had always been quieter and less prone to making awkward comments, continued her polite but minimal interactions with William's family. King Charles and William's relationship experienced some strain during this period. The king felt that his son had forced him into an uncomfortable position, making him address problems with his wife's family. William felt that his father had initially tried to dismiss his grandson's legitimate concerns in order to avoid conflict. Both men loved each other and recognized their responsibilities to family and duty. But this incident had revealed differences in how they prioritized those competing obligations. Queen Camilla struggled with feeling defensive about her son, while also understanding that Louis's feelings mattered. Her relationship with William and Catherine, which had always been cordial but not close, became even more formal and distant. There was no open hostility, but there was also not the warmth of a truly blended family. They functioned more like diplomatic allies than like people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. For Louis, the aftermath of standing his ground at that dinner table was complicated. On one hand, he felt validated and protected by his parents' response. He learned that his feelings mattered and that speaking up could lead to positive change. On the other hand, he was old enough to sense the tension his actions had caused in the larger family. Sometimes he worried that he had created problems that would never fully go away. Catherine and William worked hard to reassure Louis that the problems were not his fault. They explained that families are complicated. Sometimes the right thing to do causes temporary discomfort but leads to better understanding in the long run. They told him that by being honest about his feelings, he had actually helped everyone learn something important about treating each other with respect and kindness. As months passed, the intensity of the situation gradually faded. Family gatherings continued, though with more careful planning about seating arrangements and interaction dynamics. Tom Parker Bowles seemed to genuinely work on being more thoughtful, though he remained somewhat peripheral to the core family activities. George and Charlotte had watched everything that happened with their brother and learned their own lessons about standing up for themselves and each other. Louis slowly regained his natural cheerfulness and confidence. He still remembered what had happened and remained cautious around Tom. But he did not carry the burden of unexpressed hurt anymore. He knew his parents would listen if something bothered him again. He knew his feelings were valid and important. And he knew that sometimes being brave meant doing something that felt scary and uncomfortable, because it was the right thing to do. The incident became a defining moment in the young prince's life. Most of the public would never know the details of what happened that evening at Windsor Castle. Those within the family, however, would always remember it as the time when a 6-year-old boy taught them all an important lesson about respect, boundaries, and the courage it takes to speak truth even when doing so disrupts the careful pretense of harmony. William and Catherine often reflected on that difficult evening and the conversations that followed. They realized that in trying to maintain peace and avoid conflict within the complicated royal family structure, they had almost failed to see their own child's distress. The experience made them more determined to prioritize their children's emotional well-being over the expectations and comfort of others, even when doing so created tension with powerful family members. King Charles, for his part, came to understand that being a grandfather required different priorities than being king. His desire to have his blended family function smoothly could not override the basic requirement to ensure all children in that family felt safe, valued, and respected. It was a difficult lesson for a man who had spent his life trying to balance duty, tradition, and personal happiness with varying degrees of success. The story of Prince Louis's last warning was ultimately a story about a child's innate understanding of what was right, and about a family learning to listen to that truth, even when it was inconvenient. It was about the courage required to disrupt false harmony in pursuit of genuine respect. And it was about how sometimes the smallest, youngest voice in the room is the one speaking the most important truth that everyone else has been too polite or too comfortable to acknowledge. Louis's refusal to sit in that chair was not just childish defiance. It was a heartbreaking moment when a little boy decided he could no longer silently accept treatment that made him feel small and unworthy. His last warning was not spoken in angry words, but in the quiet determination of a child who knew something was wrong and needed it to stop. That moment changed family dynamics, forced difficult conversations, and ultimately created the possibility for more honest and healthy relationships built on genuine respect rather than obligatory politeness. The young prince had learned that his voice mattered, that his feelings were valid, and that speaking up could change things even in a world as formal and complicated as the British royal family. These were lessons that would serve him well as he grew older and faced new challenges. And perhaps most importantly, he learned that he had parents who would always choose to protect him, even when doing so was difficult or cost them something in their relationships with others. That knowledge gave Louis a foundation of security and self-worth that no amount of hurtful comments could ever fully take away.